So, good afternoon. I'm joined by Eline Blomme of Worldline. She's the head of product management e-commerce at Worldline. Eline, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Nice to speak to you, Matthijs.
Yeah, excellent. So, we'll be talking about cross-border, so specifically about cross-border in this session. Worldline is rapidly expanding in this growing part of e-commerce, and with the acquisition of Ingenico, and more recently a majority stake in ANZ in Australia, is really expanding its footprint very rapidly. Eline, no doubt you can elaborate because Worldline is, there's never a dull moment, so I may have missed something.
No, there's never a dull moment. That's a good way of saying it. Yeah, so we just got the Ingenico acquisition that has been completed in November. So we have welcomed 10,000 new employees. So we're now 20,000 people in Worldline, located worldwide. So we have a lot of offices everywhere around the world. So our footprint has become much more global as it was already before. And what we are very proud of saying is that we're the #1 European payment processor. And if we look worldwide at all the global payment players, we are the fourth biggest one. And we're actually the only one with European roots. So we're quite proud of that. At Worldline, so my mission is mainly focused on e-commerce. And what is important to mention to the audience is that Worldline is very successful in its e-commerce, in its global e-commerce. Basically, what we do is we offer with one API, we give the world to our merchants, and we give them access to all acquirer and payment methods in a very flexible way. So this is a bit different compared to other players in the market. We allow our customers to choose the service level of what they want to do themselves and what they prefer to have the payment provider to be done. And that can differ from certain markets compared to other markets where they're more or less mature or present. So that's basically a little bit about Worldline.
All right, excellent. So, before we take a deep dive, perhaps you can share some observations on 2020 with us. It was a very strange year, so always interesting to hear from such a diversified company what your observations were.
Yeah, 2020 was an interesting year for all of us. I think e-commerce in itself has been particularly interesting because if you look at one of the OECD reports of October 2020, so actually before what some of us consider the second, third wave in Europe, it already showed that e-commerce is absolutely booming. If you look at retail sales, it actually decreased from April 2019 to April 2020 with 18%. But if you look at e-commerce retail, it actually increased 30% compared to the previous year. So it's clear that 30% is massive. I mean, it was not in the forecast for anybody. So the acceleration of the growth of e-commerce has clearly moved upwards. Another thing that we have been seeing is a market shift. So we do see that not all online categories benefit from the growth. As the same report of the OECD said, that items like travel or formal clothing, like suitcases, dropped in sales, whereas other categories are actually increasing. Another very interesting point, and I'm going to try to put it as correct as possible, is that we see new customer segments. If we look, they're actually more elder people, and I'm not going to absolutely not put an age on that, what is considered elder people, but more elder people who are traditionally not e-commerce clients, they actually they became active in e-commerce for the first time. And one of the examples of that same OECD report was showing that in Japan, they had credit card data of 10 million Japanese people that showed that increase for online purchases was higher for users in their 60s, and it was increased with about 7% compared to March 2020 to 2019. So it's an interesting insight, and it confirms what most of us already feel happening in the market. And then I think the last thing that I want to conclude with this part is that it's here to stay. I think everybody's saying it, but I really, really think it's here to stay. If you look, and this I found really interesting, in the same report they were quoting JD.com, which is one of the biggest online retailers today. If you look at their history in 2004, they were mainly a brick and mortar company. Now, the SARS crisis happened in China, and that's where they really made their major shift. So you can clearly see that they already they already made that shift that many years ago, and they're now one of the biggest online retailers. So I think now also it's very important for brands to define their own strategy, because it's here to stay, and you prefer to be one of the first ones to be active in this space.
It's very interesting, and actually, in December 2020, there was a report in the Financial Times that Nike reported that their sales were back at the level of where they forecasted to be for the year, despite having stores closed either multiple times or a significant length of time. So it was all driven online. And indeed, several of the other speakers have also commented on what you're also correctly commenting on, is that brands going online, and of course this report from Nike very much underwrites that. So picking up on your point of Japan, I think that's a nice bridge into the overall topic of the session. Let's kind of travel around the world in 15 minutes and look at some interesting e-commerce countries, or let's look at some countries from an e-commerce perspective, and perhaps you can share in those countries what's a challenge, but why should people look at it? What's the opportunity? Kind of a yin-yang perspective.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because if you look at cross-border e-commerce, you can try to do that all from your headquarters and try to target certain markets in different ways. And what is important to realize that there are big markets outside of the traditional markets like Europe and US, where most of the companies are quite more established, we would say. A couple of those markets where in our strategy, we always try to have local people there that know the market. And they're interesting, obviously, in terms of size because of multiple reasons. So the BRIC countries, it's a good example of a couple of countries that are quite big. If you look at the BRIC countries in itself, they are responsible for 43% of the total e-commerce market worldwide, which is around 2 trillion in total, at a market that is worth 4.7 trillion worldwide in e-commerce. If you look at the growth rate in those markets, it's massive. It's 14% on average. So it's clearly much higher than, for example, in the UK, which is growing in e-commerce 6% only in compound annual growth rate from 2020 to 2024. Whereas, as mentioned, in the BRIC countries, it's 14%. And it's also normal because if you look at the BRIC countries, it's 40% of the world population. I do think I own the audience definition of BRIC countries because it was a quite hip definition 20 years ago when it was invented by Goldman Sachs, but it's not been used that often anymore. So BRIC countries, it's Brazil, Russia, China, and India, just to make sure that the audience understands. Now, these are just examples of very important and interesting e-commerce market, but also very, very complex markets. If you look at the different markets, each one of them has a couple of challenges, which is very important to note. So if you look at an example of an issue which can be local payment methods. If you look at Russia, Russia has a domestic scheme which is called MIR. That scheme has about 73 million cards in Russia. And the reason why this MIR card scheme happened is actually only because of 2015, the Russian government decided that Russia needs its own card scheme to protect itself from Russian dependency towards Visa and MasterCard specifically, and towards financial sanctions related to whatever world issue that takes place. Now, all of the banks have been obliged to support this card. And because of the fact that it's quite new, if you look 2015, it only started. Now there's 73 million cards in circulation on a population that has about 144 million people. That's quite big in 5 years' time. So it's a very aggressive policy. And if you look at the Russian market, the Russian government is actually pushing people to get paid on social benefits or government employees on those MIR cards. So it's important to know this, because if you don't know this and you're trying to do it from Europe business into a very interesting market as Russia, then you will not be able to get your full audience in a way that what they want to pay with. And MIR cannot be processed cross-border, so it's important to be aware of that. And that's why there's certain solutions to that you can take place or that we can help with. Another good point is consumer habits, very different in every market. If you look at China, people are mobile. It's 98% of the people is actually on mobile. If you look at e-commerce purchases, compared to 2% on desktop. So it's important to know these things of the consumer habits in each one of those markets to identify what your best checkout strategy should be and what your main focus should be in if you go to those countries. Another example we wanted to give was taxation. So taxation is a very important element if you look at a market like Brazil, because they have taxes that we don't know because we don't have them. So in Brazil, if you look at the Brazilian e-commerce landscape, you would have a majority of the people has a debit card. So if you look, 1.6 on average of Brazilian has a credit at 1.6 penetration, sorry, of debit cards is 1.6, whereas penetration of credit cards is only 0.9. However, with cross-border e-commerce, you can only pay with a credit card. And to make matters worse, it's only with a credit card that is internationally enabled by the issuer. And percentage-wise of the people, the 0.9 card penetration of people that has a credit card, only 20% of them is actually enabled for international sales. So to be able to pay in another currency. So your segment of the market that you're targeting at is going to be already much smaller. But to make worse, and this is the part of the taxation, that 20% with a credit card enabled for international sales is going to try to buy something of your website, and they're going to pay in a foreign currency. But as of the moment that the money gets deducted from their account, they will actually have to pay a 6.38% kind of effects. It's called IOF tax that will be applied, and the issuer will deduct that automatically and pay it to the government. So whatever you define as a price in that market, maybe it's a recurrent billing that you have to be aware that people are going to pay 6.38% on top of that. So if you're competing with local players, it's important to be aware of that. So that's an example of taxation. Then we had another example that we wanted to share with the audience, which was more vertical specific regulation. So India is a good example of that. India doesn't really like marketplaces being very active in their home market. So it likes to protect sometimes a bit its local players. And that's where India had certain FDI norms where they were saying that marketplaces that own their own inventory, think Amazon, they actually were only able to sell their own inventory up to 25% of a specific item on the market. Oh, wow. So this is one of the examples that they try to protect their own market against foreign players. So this is something you have to be aware of when you're making your business case before you want to go or jump into a certain market, because if you're not aware, you didn't do your exercise, it might actually look quite differently in terms of EBITDA and so on. Then another example we want to give was currency fluctuation. Well, to be honest, I live in the UK, but I'm actually a Belgian, so I have Euro and GBP accounts, and my GBP has definitely also been fluctuating a lot this year, but for different reasons. But if we look at the BRIC countries, it's a bit similar. If we look at the Brazilian real, for example, if we look at just this year, between the highest and the lowest point, it decreased with 20%. Now, this year, we all agree that it's not a great example because it's been for everybody quite spinning. But if you look at Russia, also in 2018, in like one day, they dropped with 7%. So you need kind of a solution that also takes that problem into account, because for your financial statements, you'll have to take these things and your FX exposure into account and try to find solution to mitigate that. So yeah, that was a bit more on a couple of examples of the many issues or
exactly.
opportunities.
Well, I mean, if I look at in just those 4 countries, the number of sort of details and detailed levels of complexity that you have to deal with, but they relate to everyday items, it's very complex. So yeah, just imagine if you go to more countries, yeah, the complexity no doubt keeps
Increasing. Yeah, we haven't even
Keeps
talked
keeps
about
increasing.
import taxes in Brazil, right? I mean, it's yeah. I mean,
Well,
just on top of my head, I can name 10 more just on those markets.
no, exactly. I think just setting up an entity in Brazil takes more than 70 days, and getting a bank account is another quite a number of days. So, yeah, from a speed to market, if you want to move fast, that's quite
So
that's quite a barrier.
on the point of setting up a local entity in Brazil, I think so there's a list of the World Bank of countries where it's easy or difficult to do business with. And Brazil specifically is, if I'm not mistaken, on 124 of that specific list, because the regulation and the taxation is changing constantly. And also to pay taxes, it's very, very difficult. You need to go on a certain website and so on. And if you look, the total list is 190 countries, right? The last one being Somalia. So knowing that Brazil is on 124, where I think Russia is somewhere in the 20s, I mean, it just shows how difficult Brazil is to do business with. But each one of those markets has different things.
Exactly, has a lot of challenges. Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So, we've touched already on some of the value points on, and you mentioned it's through a single API you can interact. You can interact with Worldline. What would you, in summary, be sort of the value that you bring to the table, that the solution brings?
So what is important is if we look at our merchants or their challenges, it doesn't matter for which market. If we look more high helicopter level, it's threefold. And it always links back to those three issues. It's approval rates. It's the challenge of basically having a higher market penetration. They want high availability, where we see that they want to have surety of redundancy, definitely in their biggest markets, and financial performance. So in general, everything related to cost that they can decrease. And this is basically the challenge that our customers are often discussing with us. And if we look at Worldline is different than other payment providers, acquire and partner agnostic. So we have a lot of alternative payment methods worldwide that we have integrated with this one API, a lot of acquirers that we've integrated, multiple per market, and a lot of partners that we have integrated, because there are certain other models that we can use where basically you would have, for the same thing, 2, 3, up to even 5, 6 different similar providers. Now, how, as a payment orchestrator, can you actually enable that layer even more to get the best out of it, knowing in mind what our merchants want in terms of costs, approval rates, and redundancy? Is basically by having a kind of routing structure in place. And this is what we've done, is basically we've allowed for our gateway to be in each market a kind of dynamic smart router with a retry logic. So we would we have a setup with our machine learning that can actually set certain parameters. And then we would say, we send that much to this one, that much to this one. And if the transaction still doesn't exceed, we will go to maybe the third one. What we then try to do is to have certain kind of rules. So we would have the merchant say, this is my cost with this one, this is my deal with this one, this is what I want. And then our machine learning would calculate, depending on the type of bin and the parameters set, what would be the highest chance of approval rates linked towards the cost that they're willing to pay. And then they would send that transaction away. Obviously, the system is also ensuring, as of the moment that you have an outage on one of these different partners, is that it would immediately detect or shift it away. It also makes it very flexible, because often if merchants want to shift traffic on their end, it takes quite a long time before they're actually able to migrate everything, before they can transfer things. So that makes your leverage power towards a certain acquirer or partner also a bit decreasing. And this is where this can happen instantly. It's a switch. So it's quite powerful. And then also to have on top of that the retry logic. So you know what, you are my preferred partner. I believe you're the best. Your cost is right. You're doing what you need to do for me. The latency is good, so on. And then basically you would say still a transaction for that specific bin didn't happen. We don't want that shopper online virtual being behind this computer or phone, not being able to process. So basically we just retry the transaction with the next one. If that doesn't work, we go to the next one. And that's where we feel like we are adding a lot of value. We don't want our merchants to go local to every one of those players and then try to build something similar out, because it's too complex. I mean, there's a reason why I have many product managers and developers in our teams at Worldline specialized in this. So yeah, that's what we try to do.
All right, and then and you alluded on that already a little bit. How important are partnerships in this whole setup?
It's a good point. Obviously, you have different payment providers with different strategies, but ours is very much partner related. We sometimes say we lay in the same bed with our competitors sometimes, but that's fine. That's just how it works. And that's where you have to prove always your added value, like we're trying to do with our smart routing. If you want to, you have to work with partners, like we're saying, but everybody can do that. And that's where you have to create your additional layer of smartness and added value, why still people want to work towards you. And yeah, it's been working really fine for us, to be honest. And I'm really happy with all those partners that we have, that we collaborate with, because also they have a lot of knowledge and new knowledge that we can then share and then aggregate together, to be better together. So yeah.
Excellent. All right, very nice. So yeah, I really enjoyed the trip around the world. Time is our enemy here. So before we say goodbye, perhaps do you have a final thought or prediction for 2021 with the audience?
Do I have a final thought? I think we have a lot of exciting things in the pipeline at Worldline. With the recent acquisition, it's like being a kid in a candy store, to be honest, looking at all of these assets that we have. So I'd definitely say Worldline is one to watch, what we're going to come forward with next year in terms of solutions. And yeah, we're very happy to speak to you all about it in a more detailed session.
All right, excellent. Eline, thank you very much. And I'm sure either you or somebody from the team will be on the platform. So please approach them with any questions, or otherwise come to the MGI team. Eline, a pleasure as always. Thank you very much.
Likewise, lovely to speak to you, Matthijs. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.